Hey everyone, thank you for coming in large numbers. We have over attendance under capacity issues, depends on the way you look at it. But today we have excellent speaker as part of the whole Islamic series, which has been created a few years ago. Have these kind of conversations. I have the difficult task of introducing our speaker, which is usually an easy task, but in this case, it's not quite straightforward. Because what we know is that Brett Christopher is a professor at the Institute of Housing and Urban Research at Uppsala University. We know that he also is an alumni of this university, and I think studied this very building decades ago. But then this is where it gets a bit more complicated. I know Brett as the renewable energy expert because he's published that excellent book last year, which is filled with very novel analysis, and I've rarely learned as much about renewable energy as in this book. But as we organized this lecture, some people came and said, "Oh, Brett Christopher is coming. It's the housing and urban research guy." I said, "Okay, sure." Like most of what he does. Then other people like Richard Gitaman there said, "Oh, yeah, of course, the financialization guy." I said, "Is this the same guy?" But actually, yes, it's also what he does, and he's written out books about asset managers and their portfolio. But I got to read about your past work and your books. But I was surprised to see that you've also published about geographies of television and media power. And his first book on, if I remember correctly, Christian missionaries and the continents of cultures in 19th century British Columbia. So my question is, how many of you are there? Have you watched the movie The Prestige? If you haven't watched it, probably you won't. So here's the plot. They were twins, right? So do you have a twin? How do you manage? So actually, I refer the question back to you. Who are you? And how do you actually present yourself? Because I'm sure that I'm not doing you justice in terms of the work that you do. And then I'd love to ask you more questions about how does someone like you go into these kind of topics that are sometimes very technical, but how do they give you a lens through which you can really look at those issues or the climate issues from a different perspective?
Okay, well, it's very nice to be here. Thanks everyone for turning out. I hate those kind of very lofty introductions because there's only one way from that, and it's downhill from that point on. I did do my undergrad in this building. Actually, it was the School of Geography back then, between 1990 and 1993. So showing my age. And in fact, in this room, it was weird coming back here today because when Amir was corresponding with me, I didn't put two and two together when I read the address. I was just like, Mansfield Road, yeah, that sounds a bit familiar. But it was this building. And actually in this room, I did David Harvey's Capital Reading Group in 1990. I didn't understand a word that he was talking about at the time. I was an impressionable first year undergrad. And I was like, I have no idea what he was talking about. It sounds impressive. And funnily enough, he subsequently, when I met him a couple of years ago, he put his mind back and he said, "Oh, you know who else did my reading group that year? It was a young Ed Miliband, apparently, who was doing I guess PPE at Oxford then." His dad had said, "Well, one thing you must do when you're in Oxford is go to David Harvey's Capital Reading Group." So there you go. Apparently, he was in this room as well with David Harvey. So it is really nice to be back here. I'm not really sure how to respond to that question. I think the best way I can answer it is to say that this particular project, this particular piece of work that we're going to talk about, which is the book on renewables and on electricity and climate more broadly, was a bit of a departure for me. But like pretty much everything I've done in the last 10, 15 years or so, I actually think the most important kind of part of my background in terms of enabling me to do that work was actually the part of my background you missed out, which was that between my master's and my PhD, I actually spent 8 years away from academia, working for my sins as a management consultant. I did what so many other people from from kind of back in the day. I don't know what it's like now, but back then it was like if you finished a degree at a relatively decent university in the UK and you had no idea what you were going to do, you kind of thought, oh, maybe go into consulting or somewhere in something else in London, professional service. And I did that, but yeah. And actually, it turned out that it definitely wasn't for me. It was an incredibly valuable thing to do, basically because I spent 7 or 8 years inside the world that I've subsequently been trying to understand from the outside. And so I learned much more in that part of my life and part of my career about capitalism and about how capitalist enterprises operate, whether they're renewables companies or whatever else, than I have in all the time since. And so, yes, I do kind of hop around a bit indiscriminately. That's completely fair that I do. But I do so while bringing to bear a kind of an understanding that I gleaned actually from inside the belly of the beast during those years, which has been massively valuable to me actually in the time since. I mean, I had done a little bit of work at the kind of climate energy interface before this book, but it was much more on the dirty side of the equation. So I did some work looking at to what extent institutional investors remain invested in fossil fuel companies, why they remain invested, if they're divesting, why they're doing so, those types of questions. And so this was a new development insofar as it's focused much more on the clean energy side of the equation rather than the dirty energy side. And as you know, the book is well, it has a very kind of grand title or subtitle. Publishers choose subtitles, authors don't choose subtitles. Well, it has a very grand subtitle. The book is actually in a way quite narrow. It's specifically about electricity. It is a book about electricity rather than the totality of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. It's specifically about electricity and why the electricity sector is important, and specifically about trying to offer an answer to the question about why decarbonisation of the power sector globally is going so much slower than it needs to, and to try to not sort of contradict or gainsay a range of different answers that are out there already, but to add a different kind of complexion to those and suggest that there's something else going on, as well as the things that most of the explanations typically point to when they talk about obstacles to decarbonisation.
So just to clarify that we see it as a very positive thing. We are kind of, parkour, and we take pride in our interdisciplinarity in the department. But by that, we often mean that we brought people with different disciplines to speak with one another, not like you that brought different disciplines to the same human. And but actually, that's interesting to hear about how it's giving back to look at some of the issues. You talk about the title of your book, which is very good, The Price is Wrong, but it's not as spicy as the title of his first book, which I won't say on the Christian missionaries, but you can look for it. So you talked about explaining why decarbonization is not happening at the pace that we would like. Most of us here, we rejoice. I guess I can speak for most of us. We rejoice when we hear that the price of renewables and renewable technology is falling down. These are some good news. That there's more and more investments in renewables in some countries that is expanding faster than fossil fuels. That there are more subsidies for renewable energy. And in a dark world that gives us some hope. But then in your book, you just crush this kind of lights of hope. But why? What do you think are there for those misconceptions? Why do they exist? And how does your book kind of really say what's going on in the decarbonization space?
Right. I mean, so I think the first thing to say is just to say a little bit about how the decarbonisation of the power sector is actually going. If I believe this some basic and much of this I'm sure will be familiar to many people in the room, but I'm sure that not all of it will be familiar to everyone. So it's important to lay that out. And as you say, there are lots of very, very kind of positive narratives about that out there about that, which is understandable, as you also say, because there's not much else to be positive about. And if you see those charts showing genuinely rapid growth in the last decade or so, both in the amount of investment that's going into solar and wind power, not only solar and wind, but particularly solar and wind, in terms of zero or low carbon electricity, and also the amount of electricity that's being generated from renewables. And those charts do slope rapidly upwards, and that you would think that that's a very good story, and in many ways it is. However, the reality is that notwithstanding that growth, we globally are continuing every year to generate more and more electricity from burning fossil fuels. So all of that growth in clean energy that has occurred has been purely supplemental to, rather than substitutive of, power generation from dirty sources. Which is why, and many of you I'm sure will have heard of this, but there's a new book out by the French energy historian Fresso called More and More and More. That's the basic argument of that book, which is kind of a depressing argument, which is that the whole idea of energy transitions is flawed because we've never actually gone through an energy transition historically. What we've gone through is periods of energy addition, where new energy sources come along and they don't displace what we used before, they simply add to them and interact with them in important ways. And thus far, that's absolutely a true description of what's happening now. We're going through a period of energy addition, not energy substitution. So, to me, it feels like it would be irresponsible to say that we are in any sense kind of winning on electricity decarbonisation while generation from fossil fuels is still going up. So that's kind of where, and of course it varies massively regionally around the world. Which is obviously really important. So different countries face completely different levels and nature of challenges in terms of decarbonising their power sectors. So where I live in Sweden, for example, electricity generation has always been essentially carbon free. For as long as anyone can remember, it's decades since there was any real fossil fuels involved in electricity generation. It's a mix of nuclear and hydro, and then increasingly wind. Whereas there are lots of other countries in the world where in excess still of 90% of electricity generation is still from burning fossil fuels, particularly across the global south, which I'm sure we'll want to come back to talk about that. But not only, and there are certainly countries which, like the US, like Germany, for example, which should be given their resources, should be much further down the line of decarbonisation of the power sectors than they are. I think the US is still around 60% fossil fuels electricity generation, which is ridiculous given the resources that it has at its disposal. So with that said, that's how we're going. The fact that it's very regionally distributed. So the argument, and this gets to finally kind of try to answer your question, the argument that is kind of out there is that the obstacles to faster decarbonisation that principally exist around the world are of a kind of a political / policy nature typically. And so everyone will have heard examples of this. It's people point to things like, it takes much too long waiting to get the necessary planning permissions from local planning authorities to get a new wind or solar farm approved for development. It takes much too long waiting in the queue to get your connection to the grid if you're a solar or wind energy developer. NIMBY interests have too much influence in terms of stymieing local developments, and a whole range of other factors which, to the extent that we can disentangle kind of economic factors on the one hand from political / policy factors on the other, and I know that's a problematic distinction, but if we allow that distinction, those arguments focus on the former, and what they further say is that the economics aren't a problem precisely because of what you mentioned, which is the fact that, particularly since around 2010, the technological cost, the cost of generating electricity from solar and wind have really tumbled, have come down a long, long way.
So now cheaper than fossil fuels.
In many parts of the world, since actually around 2015, in many parts of the world, it's been as cheap, if not cheaper, to generate electricity from solar and wind as from burning coal or natural gas, which are the main fossil fuels used in electricity generation. Oil is used much less than it used to be. And so that kind of dominant narrative said the economics can no longer be an obstacle, precisely because look at those cost trends. Now, the argument I make in the book is not that those other political and policy type obstacles aren't real, aren't obstacles. Absolutely, they are to different degrees in different ways in different parts of the world. For sure, they are. And nor is the argument that those cost declines haven't happened, or that they're not a good thing. They're a great thing, and not. I mean, in a way, that's obvious. So, to the extent that the world has decarbonized electricity and has developed much more solar and wind power, it has occurred at much lower cost to consumers / taxpayers than would otherwise have been the case, obviously, because the costs have come down so far. And it's primarily thanks to China that those costs have come down as far as they have. Most of the development, most of the learning and production efficiencies that have enabled those cost reductions have been thanks to large-scale manufacturing in China. So that's not the argument either. The cost reductions are real; they're great to the extent that they've been enjoyed. The argument is that just because those cost reductions have occurred doesn't mean that the economic obstacles to faster wind and solar development have been have been swept away. There are significant remaining economic constraints standing in the way of solar and wind development that we fail to appreciate if we simply look at this through the lens of relative generating costs, which is the lens that we use. And so the argument of the book is actually quite a straightforward argument. There's a lot of kind of technical analysis underlying it, which we don't necessarily need to get into. Hopefully supporting the argument. The argument itself is quite straightforward, which is the following, which is that the economic obstacle that really continues to stand in the way of faster wind and solar deployment it has to do with profitability rather than generating costs, and that actually you learn much more about the renewables business, the economics of renewables, the challenges facing renewables developers if you think about that business proposition through the lens of profitability rather than through the lens of generating cost. And I'm fully aware that some people will be thinking in the back of their mind, well, hang on a sec, aren't they effectively the same thing? Is it not the case that if your generating costs are lower, then your profits are higher? And that isn't necessarily the case. And I'm happy to talk about the reasons for that if you want to. But for now, let's just stick with the argument that it's about profitability. And so, as I said, the basic argument in the book is that actually, in terms of profitability, the business of solar and wind deployment, which is the business not of manufacturing, so I'm not talking about manufacturing solar cells and solar modules and manufacturing wind turbines. I'm just talking about the business of developing wind and solar farms, owning and operating them, and selling the electricity that they generate over the course of their useful life, which might be 25, 30 years. That business is simply not a particularly attractive business in profitability terms. There are certain important profitability constraints associated with that business that have a chilling impact on investment in the absence of things like significant state subsidies that can potentially make them more profitable. And I think that the thing that's probably most important to appreciate about that argument is why that argument is potentially significant, which may be obvious, but it might not be obvious. And the reason is this, which comes back to how the world is going about trying to develop solar and wind power. And so if you look around the world, in most parts of the world, governments are relying principally on the private sector to do this. So in most parts of the world, and absolutely there are important exceptions to this rule, of which China is far and away the most significant example. But in most parts of the world, what governments are doing, and the UK is absolutely a case of this, notwithstanding the kind of hoopla around GB Energy or whatever it's called. But in most parts of the world, what governments are doing is saying to the private sector, we expect you to develop the wind and solar power. We expect you to own and operate those facilities. We expect you to own and sell that electricity. We are not going to do that ourselves. In other words, we are not going to have significant publicly owned and operated renewable energy companies. This is going to be a private sector thing. We, governments, policymakers, will nudge the private sector in the right direction through incentives, subsidies of various kinds, where we believe that's necessary, but we're not going to do it ourselves. And so insofar as in most parts of the world, we are relying on the private sector to deliver the quote unquote energy transition, we are obviously relying on a set of actors who are whose activities and investments are shaped in the first place, and maybe even also in the last place, by profitability expectations. That's what the private sector is, a set of actors that operates principally on the basis of profit expectation. And if those expectations are not what we might hope them to be, they are not going to undertake that investment. And that's the basic argument in the book, is that the investment is going too slowly because there are certain profitability constraints, profitability hurdles that people haven't made enough fail in the debate about the energy transition and renewables. And that's the basic argument.
And the book really explains why, even though renewable-based electricity could be cheaper, it's just not as profitable business for a company than fossil fuels would be. But then you question capitalism as a kind of model to organize these kind of investments. Is it that capitalism really cannot save the planet, or are there ways to reform capitalist model of production to make it happen?
So that's a big question. Good question. And I think it's easy for people who haven't read the book, when they see the subtitle, to think, this is just kind of another lefty rant against capitalism. But I don't think it is that, and I hope it doesn't read that way. And I don't think it is. I hope it's a bit more of a sophisticated argument than that. But I think in terms of, let me say this is going to be a bit of a long-winded answer, but let me say two things. And obviously, any of what I say now, please feel free to ask questions and make objection later, which we'll have lots of time to do. So the first, let me say a couple of very quick things about why it is, despite those falling generating, that there are still these profitability constraints. So one of them, I mean, and this, I think this is quite, maybe an obvious point, but it's worth making, is simply that just because, so for example, if people like to make, as we've said, this simplistic comparison between generating costs of electricity based on solar or wind and generating costs based on burning coal, for example, and the kind of the assumption, which is sometimes spoken but more often unspoken, is that if your generating costs are lower, then it's a better investment proposition. But there's actually a very obvious reason why that might not necessarily be the case, which is that even though the electricity that's generated from solar or wind resources is essentially the same thing as the electricity generated from burning natural gas or coal, it's just electricity, it's just electrons. Those two energy sources, obviously, and I'm sure everyone will know here, produce electricity of different types with different degrees of reliability on different time frames. Wind and solar are famously intermittent. They tend to produce electricity on different schedules at different times of the day and month. In other words, while you might be producing just electricity in each case, you're producing different types of electricity with different degrees of market, with different levels of market value. So just because your costs are low, it doesn't mean your profit's going to be higher, because you might be producing a product which has much less market value than the power that tends to be produced by natural gas or coal-fired power plants. So that's one thing. But there's another thing to think about too, which and this is one of the things I talk about a lot in the book, which is the question of competition. And so one of the reasons why one of the reasons in my view why it remains the case that it's much more profitable to kind of drill for oil or gas for a BP or a Shell, for example, than to develop solar or wind farms has to do with the industry structure that you have in those two different cases. So, famously, in the international oil and gas industry is shot through with oligopoly power of different kinds. OPEC is nothing if not a price fixing cartel that exists precisely in order to kind of smooth out and maintain levels of pricing and hence profitability, precisely to incentivize further investment in new fossil fuels. Nothing typically like that anywhere in the world exists in the electricity sector. Electricity generation is a very competitive business, particularly renewable electricity generation, and that has all sorts of important implications in terms of investment. So if you take a hypothetical, so imagine, for example, that you are a wind farm developer that's been in business for the last 15 or 20 years. Over that period, as we've said, you would have seen the technological cost, the cost of the turbines, come down dramatically over that 15 to 20 years. You would think that as a result of that, oh great, my generating costs have been coming down significantly. That's something to celebrate. My costs have been coming down, down. My profits are going to go up. But that's absolutely not necessarily the case. Your ability to increase your profits as a result of those cost reductions depends entirely on your ability to essentially privatize and capture the benefits of those cost reductions. But of course, if you exist in a very competitive industry, which renewables generators do, what actually happens is that those cost reductions, the benefits of them get competed away through price-based competition. They get passed downstream, and in fact to subsequent parts of the supply chain, whether that's transmission companies, distribution companies, electricity retailers, or they get passed all the way to households. And of course, that's what politicians want. Politicians have been saying to consumers in countries like the UK for a long time now, we are going to deliver the energy transition, and we are going to do it at low or minimal cost to consumers or taxpayers. So they want the benefits of those cost reductions to be realized by consumers. Well, that's fine, but you can't have that and at the same time have the benefits of those cost reductions realized by developers in the form of above average level of profitability that will incentivize for it. It's like you can't have your cake and eat it. You have one thing or the other. And so governments like the UK's are perpetually caught kind of between a rock and a hard place, between, on the one hand, wanting this business to be sufficiently profitable that further investment by the private sector will be incentivized, but on the other hand, they want all of this to occur at lowest absolute cost to households. And those two things simply don't really go together. And I think that if you listen to and read what the Labour Party here in the UK, for example, has been saying about energy and its plans for renewables over the last couple of years, they still don't really get that. They still don't really understand the fact that they can't successfully thread the needle between those two imperatives. So that's just and there's a whole host of other reasons why there are profitability constraints. There's also a lot of stuff to do with the volatility of electricity pricing in electricity markets, which also has really significant implications for profitability and for investment, which I'm more than happy to talk about, but I won't now. But I want to get to where your actual question was, which is what we do about this, and whether kind of capitalism in one form or another can be kind of tweaked to deliver much more rapid decarbonisation than is currently occurring. I think so. The best way I can answer that question is because I don't know the answer. I haven't got a I'm one of those academics that finds it much easier to point to problems than come up with solutions. But I think there are a range of different answers out there from people who recognise the problem. And there are definitely lots of people that do recognise the problem. They might not articulate it in precisely the way I've done in the book, but for sure there are people that know this stuff about profitability. And I've had some of the most interesting reaction I've had to the book actually has come from people within the energy industry saying, yeah, this is exactly what we're dealing with on a daily basis, and it's cool to see someone articulate it in that way. So for sure, there's people that realise it, as I say, even if they haven't put it in these terms. And I think there's a range of different answers out there, and actually, and not surprisingly, those answers or suggestions are associated with different constituencies, different interest groups, who have different incentives and different positionalities at stake. And actually, I have sympathy with all of those suggestions to one degree or another. So it's worth just running through. And again, some of these will be familiar to people. So I think the first constituency would be energy economists, by which I mean mainstream economists who focus specifically on energy. And there's loads of really, really good. Classic case would be Dieter Hellen I think he's here in Oxford actually, who's one of the people that the press always goes to when they want to quote on what's going on with the British energy sector. Dieter Hellen. So people in that world, they would argue that there are two possible answers to resolving these problems and sort of overcoming these profitability constraints that I talk about. So one of those is kind of market redesign. So the basic argument that you get from those people is they say, well, the problem is not that we're relying on the private sector to do this. The problem is not that we're depending on capital to deliver the energy transition. The problem is that we haven't got the market design right. So, and the reason I have a degree of sympathy with them is that they are right to say, which they do say, that electricity markets, as we typically have them around the world today, in liberalized energy markets in places like Europe, North America, and other parts of the world, those markets were designed and introduced in the context of a very different world 20, 30 years ago. Essentially, it was a fossil fuel world. And we haven't redesigned those markets to reflect the fact that we are now living in, or at least wanting to live in, a different world with a different supply mix. We need to change the way in which electricity is priced, the way it's bought and sold in retail and wholesale markets. And if we get the market design right, everything else will kind of fall into place. And as I say, I have some sympathy with that argument. I don't completely agree with it, but there's a certain degree of credibility to it. One of the reasons I don't is that's always economists' answer. It's always a question of markets. The problem is never markets in the first place. It's that we haven't got the market design right, but we can. It's like the eternal elusive goal, right? We just need to optimize the market design. And it poo-poos the idea that the problem might be that we're actually doing this, trying to do it through markets in the first place. The other sort of answer that those economists give you, and this will be the one that you'll be more familiar with, is they'll say, the problem is that we are not pricing properly, putting a proper price on the unpriced externalities associated with fossil fuels. So they'll say, look, the reason that solar and wind power remain uncompetitive as an investment proposition is that when we burn oil and gas, we generate a series of environmental externalities, carbon, that we're not putting a proper price on. We need to have proper carbon prices, proper carbon taxes, and if we do that, then as a result of doing that, the economics of renewables will become much more competitive by dint of doing that. And again, I have some sympathy with that. And actually, the UK is a great case of somewhere where there's proof of that working. So, as I'm sure most of you in the room know, the UK recently phased out its last coal-fired power plants, which is a great success. And it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons the UK was able to do that is that the UK has had, at least for a decade, a very targeted carbon tax on coal-fired power generation. And that has played a significant role in helping to render coal-based electricity uncompetitive in the UK. So there's clearly a role for that. I think the question mark around carbon taxes more broadly clearly has to do with the political difficulties of introducing them, right? Obvious point, but around the world, particularly in the global north, we live incredibly carbon-intensive lifestyles. And if you start properly pricing carbon, then you end up with inflation of a degree that would make what happened 2 or 3 years ago look kind of like child's play, and you end up getting voted out of power. So the idea that any government around the world is gonna induce kind of greenflation, as it's sometimes called, willingly, seems to me politically far-fetched, even if intellectually it makes sense. So that's what you hear, I think, from economists. If you talk to people in the industry, in the private sector, the energy sector, their answer is, they agree, they obviously agree with those economists that the problem is not that we're relying on the private sector to do this. They say that's what we should be doing. But where they disagree is with the idea that we need to change markets. Then they say, no, markets are fine as we have them as well. What we need is more and better subsidy. So that's their basic argument. It's like, let's just leave everything as it is, but just throw more subsidy at us. And then we'll invest on the scale that you want us to. And that's effectively what the Inflation Reduction Act was in the US. That was the US administration's answer to being told by the US energy sector over a series of years, look, you've been reducing the level of tax credit available for renewables, which the American government had been doing. They'd been bringing the level of tax credit down. Look what happens when you're doing that. Investment stagnates. You need to lift those tax credits back up to where they originally were, 30%, and extend them for a decade or more. And then this was the unspoken bit, that will help lift profitability back up, expected profitability back up to a level that will see investment flowing back in. So that's absolutely what the Inflation Reduction Act was about trying to reinflate profitability, expected profitability in the renewable sector. So that's the industry's answer. And I have a degree of sympathy with that as well. It's like, if the options on the table in terms of decarbonisation are, if there are only 2 options on the table, let's put it that way. One is like full-throated subsidy for the private sector to incentivize the private sector to decarbonize electricity. And as a result of that, the private sector makes a lot of money out of doing it. If that's one option, and the other option is like refusing to give that subsidy because it might, it sticks in our craw to subsidize capital, and capital they're not investing. I would take option A every day of the week because you might end up with BlackRock making a lot of money, but at least you have a solution of sorts to climate change. The problem, of course, is that we are stuck with those 2 options, seemingly politically. And the option that doesn't appear to be on the table is the kind of the option that the third and final constituency talks to, which is essentially the left. And horrible generalization, but to the extent that there's a different answer on the table, it does typically come to the left. And the left, and the answer there is to say, well, look, the problem is that we're relying on the private sector and markets to do this. We've been relying on markets and the private sector principally from the beginning of when we were trying to deliver an energy transition. It's still not working. And maybe therefore that's a lesson that our reliance on the private sector and markets to do this is actually the problem. I think that that's again I'm going to have a lot of sympathy with, and there's all sorts of kind of interesting signs to suggest that argument is true, not least what's going on in China. It's surely not coincidental that the one country that has been growing renewables investment at rates far faster than anywhere else in the world in recent years is the one country that isn't relying on the profit motive to deliver it, right? Which is China. So in 2023, the figures for 2024 aren't available yet. In 2023, 65% of all investment globally in new renewables capacity was in China. But even more strikingly than that, the share of growth in renewables investment in 2023 compared with 2022 that was delivered by China was well in excess of 90%. So China was literally the only country that was substantially growing its investment in 2023 compared with 2020. The rest of the world didn't advance at all, which is why when you see those charts saying, look at this great global growth in renewables, it's like, well, it's completely misleading. That's just China. The rest of the world is not progressing in the slightest. It's all, and that's the one country where that development is not driven by the profit motive, because while profits certainly play a part, over 90% of wind and solar development is in the hands of state-owned companies that are financed by state-owned banks that are receiving credit from state-owned and state-directed central bank. And so it's a project that is massively shaped and directed by Beijing and by provincial authorities. It's not something that's about the profit motive. So the argument from the left, look, we've been relying on the private sector, we've been relying on it, it's not working. Now it's time to try something different, which and that something different is what's typically suggested is public ownership of energy in general, renewable energy in particular. And the argument for that, for a publicly owned and led energy transit is certainly not only about profit. It's certainly not only about the stuff about profitability that I've been talking about. There's all sorts of other good reasons to favour public ownership, I think, not least around questions around kind of the degree of kind of coordination that is required and planning, for want of a kind of an old word which has come back into fashion, that something like an energy transition requires. But I think the profit argument is part of it. If returns of say 5, 6, 7%, which is typically what you expect, what you get in renewables on average, are not proving sufficient to incentivize massive private sector investment, you would imagine that returns at that level should be sufficient for the public sector to invest in, and it would be investing in revenue generating assets. It's not like they would be borrowing to invest in to spend on kind of current expenditure. The public sector would be borrowing to invest in revenue generating assets. So you would imagine that relatively low levels of return should be quite sufficient. Last thing I'll say before something, I know I've talked too long already and answered your question, is to say that I definitely have sympathy with that argument as well, as you might expect me to. But I also don't think it's like a universal solution either. It's talking about massive public investment in energy infrastructure is one thing in rich parts of the world, which the UK still just about is, I suppose, despite what the government thinks and says about its own fiscal disabilities. Clearly, the UK public sector can affordably do a lot more than it thinks it can and says it can. But that's an entirely different proposition in parts of the world where governments are operating under much more severe fiscal constraints than they are in the global north. So to suggest that you're going to get a big green state investing in massive green infrastructure through public borrowing in Vietnam or Senegal or Nigeria or India even I think currently strikes me as very, very far fetched. So I think that yes, public ownership, but it's definitely not a universal answer. And so that brings us, I guess, to the point about the geography of all this.
I guess that's why your book could have easily turned into a bummer when you start reading it in terms of what the problems are, your way of actually explaining the reason of what we're seeing is extremely helpful, and also talking about what different options look like. I have so many more questions in developing countries, but I don't want to be greedy. I don't want to be like BlackRock and everything. So, and this is the conversation. So we should open up for questions and then back.
of questions of any description, whether that's clarification or doesn't matter.
So let's take a round of.
I might not be able to answer them. I'll try.
Let's start with you, and then Nikita, and then there's someone there. Yeah. And Nikita.
Yeah, nice to meet you. My name is William. I study energy systems here, and I worked for a decentralized, like, virtual power plant startup in the US, so completely understand your thoughts here. I kind of wanted to hear your opinion. You touched on it briefly. It's kind of, I guess, two-pronged. One is the idea of burdening, especially in the global South, public budgets with financing green projects, and what that looks like from A, energy access, and the idea of, like, cheap, reliable power, and B, how that might overburden other pretty critical social needs and services. And then number two, you mentioned the idea of nationalization of power grids. As somebody who's worked in kind of the distributed energy resources space, I wanted to hear your thoughts on what that might mean for the idea of aggregation of either political or economic power in the hands of a few, like you see with the Gulf states and control of oil fields, and also energy security with the idea of energy democratization and decentralization.
Yeah, there are lots of questions.
Thank you for that. Energy has been a public good in many parts of the world. And it is also commodity, like, in a Polanyian sense. It's very hard to put a price on it. It is with neoliberal reform that in many parts of the world we have privatized energy production and distribution, and now also transmission. So the idea that we can't go back to a public system when, my country, India, had public energy till 1990, Indonesia still does, is not impossible. Can I add to that?
Professorial privilege.
Yeah. In the parts of the world that I study, the subsidy model is very popular, but it is generating dictatorial regimes. So you have these strongman governments, which we are seeing in so many parts of the world, deeply subsidizing the chosen coal players, which are now going into green energy. So the subsidy bit will happen, but at deep political cost.
Thank you so much for that. My research also looks at India, but specifically on solar energy.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you think is the role of battery storage innovation, specifically with regards to when we're talking about the generation costs for renewable energy, and how that interacts with this concept of innovation within a capitalistic framework where we have this big part of the picture of the cost, which is the battery storage, but we still don't actually have the technology to drive it. And if you could speak to how that relates to knowledge transfers in when it comes to technology for climate change between the global governments.
Okay. Right. There were at least 10 different questions spread across those three. And obviously I'm not going to be able to answer them. I'll say three things that hopefully will offer some thoughts on at least some of those questions from all of you. So I'll start with the storage thing, the battery storage question. And one of the reasons I want to do that is that many people see storage, whether that's battery-based storage or other technologies for storing electricity, as a kind of almost like the kind of silver bullet, the great hope to help kind of resolve some of the problems that I talk about in the book. For those who don't necessarily know a lot about this stuff, obviously one of the problems with electricity and specifically with renewables is that they don't necessarily produce energy at the time you need it. And right now, we only have pretty limited capacities for storing electricity at times it's produced when it's not needed, for times when it's not producing and when it is needed. And batteries are one of the main ways in which that can happen. Developments right now are much better for kind of short duration storage, so it's longer duration storage that is the much bigger challenge. So, storing it across seasons rather than across hours or days. But it's definitely the case that there is a lot of hope being invested in storage, that it will kind of help resolve some of those investment obstacles that I was talking about. It's definitely, and for example, if you look, I don't know about the Indian case specifically on storage investment, but certainly in for example, the US, pretty much every major new solar or wind development that's occurring now has storage as part of the investment. Like batteries are a part of the investment proposition, rather than being kind of standalone wind or solar. So based on people I've talked to kind of in and around that world, it seems to me that the jury is still very much out on the extent to which storage is going to make a difference, specifically in terms of the investability of renewables, and just a couple of reasons for that. So one is that, and a lot of this comes down to the volatility issue, the volatility of production, the volatility of pricing, and what the hope is that the introduction of storage can help smooth out that volatility and remove the investment obstacles associated with that volatility. And two issues. So one is that while it's possible that storage will do that, there are and will be other parallel developments that will be likely to have a counteractive impact in terms of volatility, like the retirement of coal plants, which is likely to increase volatility all the while that storage potentially reduce it. And then the other thing is a really interesting point is the concern about cannibalization, which is like the whole business model for storage is that volatility exists, and if the growth of storage mitigates that volatility, then in a way it cannibalizes the prospects for its own future, because it takes away the very thing that represents the investment proposition in the first place. There's concerns about cannibalization there as well. So I think that I think we'll know a lot more in the next couple of years, but right now it's much too early to tell. We don't really. So there's a lot of kind of, as you know, there's a lot of kind of hope around it. We'll see. The second thing I want to say specifically on the question of public ownership and kind of the hopes that are invested in public ownership, but also some of the fact that what both of you refer to is that very often, both historically and today, public ownership doesn't end up, whether it's in the energy sector or in any other sector, clearly doesn't end up looking like its advocates might have hoped it might look like. And I totally agree with that. I totally take those concerns, and I think it's clear in the book that I'm anything but a kind of utopian romanticist when it comes to public ownership. There are just as many examples of bad custodianship of utility assets and others by public sector owners as there are private sector owners. And one of my great inspirations for all my work was Dori Massey, and she did this, and I always go back to the work she did on public land ownership in the late 1970s. And while she was a great advocate for public land ownership, she made the point that that public ownership is almost kind of worthless if public ownership just ends up looking like private ownership. And so if you have public sector actors that have the same sets of incentives, the same kinds of operating mechanisms and financial structures as private sectors, then there's almost no point in having public. The only point of public sector ownership is if you encourage and enable and incentivize that public sector actor to behave fundamentally differently from a private sector actor. And I think Amir and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. One of the problems with public energy ownership in so many parts of the world, like Norway or Sweden, where I live, would be a great example of this, is yes, you have public sector ownership of energy in the forms like Vattenfall and Equinor and Statkraft, but they're no different from private sector. So there's no point in having public sector ownership unless there are mechanisms in place to safeguard and incentivize very different types of custodianship and behaviour. So that's just, not necessarily an answer to the question. That's the second observation. The third and final thing I wanted to say was about that. I think what you were getting at about kind of constraints on public budgets in parts of the global south, and whether investment in publicly owned energy could potentially crowd out other things, other types of equally urgent incentives in those parts. And it's definitely true. That part of the world is not my specialty. But whenever I talk to people who work on energy in particularly in Africa, but not only in Africa, they always kind of laugh at the idea of energy transition, because they say, well, energy access is the challenge, right? And what are you talking about, energy transition? And so clearly there's a huge potential for people like myself, based in the global north and focused primarily on the global north, to talk about these things in ways that pay no heed to the realities on the ground there. What I would say about investment in that part of the world, though, is that as I understand it, one of the main obstacles is simply the cost of financing in that part of the world, which is to say that if you are a private sector wind energy developer in trying to develop a new wind farm in the UK or in the Netherlands or in Sweden or whatever, maybe you have to pay 4 or 5% interest on your loan to develop your wind farm. If you're trying to do that in sub-Saharan Africa, the same lenders will charge you 12 to 15% on that loan, because of the perception of higher risk of that investment. It's not because the risk necessarily is high, but it's perceived to be, and there's risk perceptions that shape interest rates. And because of that, literally no project is going to get off the ground if it has to borrow at that rate, because it will make the economics completely unviable. And so the only projects that get off the ground today are either ones that are financed by the public sector, which is almost none because of the fiscal constraint, or it's where you get the kind of blended finance model where the World Bank or someone else or a philanthropic institution comes in and says, like, we'll effectively subsidize the cost of capital to help bring the blended capital cost down to a level which makes it affordable. But of course, there's only so much of that kind of blended finance available, and it's not even remotely on the scale that's necessary. And as far as I can tell, if that remains the only model on the table for helping incentivize and enable that type of investment, then investment on the scale is never going to happen. Basically, which is, there was a great, amazing, and this is going on too long, but it was really striking. So about a year and a half ago, I can't remember his name, but whoever had been the energy editor at the Financial Times left his job to take up another. He wrote this kind of final column on like what I've learned about energy in my time as energy editor at the Financial Times, and he made this amazing point where he basically said the main thing I've learned is that it's laughable that people even question the fact that the energy transition in the global south will have to be paid for by the global north. He's like, of course it will. But no one's willing to listen to that. But he was like, yeah, it's completely obvious. And that was the energy editor of the FT. It's like, yeah, of course so.
There's a lot to say about the developing world. Another question, but let's take another round. Let's go. I'm seeing around the room, Iran.
Basically, based on the discussion just now, if I interpret correctly, trying to think of quite a positive example when it comes to like stay-led initiatives leading to lots of good investment. But I mean, I was just looking at some statistics online, and it was saying that in 2023, China still accounted for like 95% of coal power construction worldwide. So I'm just really interested in hearing opinions on, like despite this, effort in investing in green energy, why does the government in China still, continue to invest in coal plants?
Yeah, absolutely. Another question? Jeremy works on state-led investment in general, related to everything.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was wondering, all of this has been very much like bottom-up state-led kind of initiatives. And if there's any point in looking at top-down approaches to decarbonization, and like if there's any hope in those. And one example I was thinking about is climate activists who are friends of mine in Germany who are teaching communities basically how to put solar panels on their own roofs.
Yes.
What do you think about that? Other examples?
Third question.
I'm thinking more about the labor challenges and when it comes to like the dependency that many people in many developing countries have on, the like more dirty energy producing sector. And kind of like how would you address the energy transition without really impacting like in a very way the lives of many people. Like it's like more not like highly skilled labor, but more technical labor.
Probably enough. Yeah. Again, I'll go in. We'll go in reverse order, and you might have to remind because my brain's beginning to frazzle. You might have to remind me of the first two questions. But on the labour question, I mean that's it's not just in developing countries, but Scotland. Oh, that's a developing country, but sorry. Everywhere in the world, like these are important questions, and there's tons of research that shows that, not surprisingly, people working in the extractive sector, whether it's coal miners or oil rig workers or refinery plant workers or whoever else it is, have massive concerns about the energy transition in terms of what that means for jobs, their communities, and that those concerns are completely understandable. And I think that scholars have barely scratched the surface of coming to grips with those concerns and paying due heed to those concerns. I'm always amazed when political parties in whatever country, but the UK is a great example of this, say, we're going to deliver this energy transition and it's going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs, but there's never any substance as to what those jobs are going to actually look like. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I drive past a wind or solar farm, one of the most conspicuous things is like no one works there. Occasionally someone will have to go out with a screwdriver to kind of, but they're hardly labour-intensive industries, and that's like the elephant in the room often around these discussions that nobody wants to talk about, but people should be talking about. And so I think those concerns are completely real and completely credible and completely important. And I think the fact that they often just kind of get brushed off is a real problem. The second question was about
the top-down approach.
So distributed energy. A really important question. And you were saying about having worked in distributed energy. So one of the other things that people point to as part of a potential solution of decarbonisation is for much more distributed energy generation, much more local, whether that's rooftop or whether it's community-owned assets. I think that 100% that is and will continue to be an important part of the answer. Has to be. But there are all sorts of really important questions about how local, whether it's domestic or community-owned resources, get integrated technically and economically into an electricity system, which in countries like the UK is a centralised grid-based system, where the cost of the grid, the transmission and distribution networks it's effectively a social resource, right? And the cost of that gets socialized across households, across the different companies that are parts of the network, whether it's as generators or distributors. And one of the problems you can end up with, and Australia is a really good example of this, is that once people start developing rooftop solar in particular and start going off grid, then of course the costs of the grid have to get shared across a diminishing number of people and end up having to get subsidized by the state. So I think there's lots of interesting work being done at the interface of engineering and economics now about how you kind of encourage and integrate distributed energy into what will have to continue to remain a grid-based system. I think the exception to that, and this is another, alongside storage, I think this is another area in which a lot of people are placing a lot of hope, would be in parts of the global south where you've never had that kind of centralized grid development. And in a way, the argument, I think, is that you can kind of leapfrog that and go straight towards a much more distributed energy type system, and therefore kind of circumvent the cost and hassle of having that centralized grid. So in a way, I think those types of developments have more potential in the global south than they do in the global north, where we are locked into that kind of legacy infrastructure for better or for worse. And historically, it's been for better. Clearly, it's been for better historically. On China, I mean, China is nothing if not contradictory, right? I mean, yes, it's by far and away the world leader on renewables, both in terms of deployment and in terms of manufacturing, right? For all the Inflation Reduction Act and protectionism and so on, it still dominates the supply chain on both solar and wind technology. But as you say, it is also the world leader in developing new coal-fired power plants. And of course, the main reason for that is that energy demand is still growing in China, by no means as fast as it was growing around 10 years ago, but it's definitely still growing at a significant clip. And so the policy effectively remains more of everything, which means more on the clean side and on the dirty side, unfortunately. I think that increasingly the data suggests that the weighting is towards the clean side, but absolutely and I think one of the interesting and kind of scary things about that is that part of the reason why energy demand is still growing as quickly as it is in China, and part of the reason why some of that is still being met by coal-fired development is precisely because of climate change, because of the physical impacts of climate change, which is longer and more frequent droughts that are compromising the country's hydro capacity, and hydroelectricity delivers a type of power that solar and wind typically don't provide. So coal-fired power becomes the answer to that. And then just longer and more severe heat waves, and therefore a massive growth in air conditioning units that is just driving. So there's this kind of vicious cycle between climate change and the kind of social economic response to engineering response to climate change that's really problematic, but really, really interesting. So China is, the last thing I want to do is lionize China. Is simply to make a point that I think it's instructive that with a very different political economy, you can get development on a pace and on a scale that is different, where you're relying upon a privatized, marketized system, where you're relying on kind of a disaggregated set of actors to kind of come together. And the idea that kind of markets can coordinate all of that in the context of all of the different challenges of climate change and the energy transition strikes me as laughable. There has to be a larger role for the state.
Speaking of climate change, it's getting quite warm in this room.
Yeah.
I think we have some refreshments outside. We have 10 more minutes.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
And then if you want to get a drink and come back, you can also do that. It's just outside. I want to ask you a question about developing countries. A lot of the people here work in developing countries or from developing countries. also specific concerns, especially on the team side, about how to talk about climate issues and energy transitions from a developing country perspective. In your book, you highlight something that is a bit of a tension, or a bit of an uncomfortable truth, in which you explain very clearly that the global north has been responsible for most of the historic emissions, but the emissions that are now coming, most of them are going to come from developing countries. And most of the increase,
Most of the growth.
most of the growth, and you mentioned Nigeria, Bangladesh, other countries, India. So how do you actually bring developing countries? You said that you work mostly on the global north, but what does this kind of integration look like from that point of view? And isn't there this kind of like tension in terms of taking the responsibility for climate change versus the pragmatic reality of where can we reduce that emission growth in the next 3 years? And if someone else wants to come in with a few questions before.
I just have a question, building on the point about the distributed energy. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the impact of large AI and data companies that are currently starting to just build their own energy and directly work with the energy companies and take that completely out of the kind of government's purview.
Any other final question? Well, by the way, for those sitting on the floor, kindly, there is now seats. If you want to sit, if you're comfortable there, that's fine. But you have options. Go ahead.
Thank you, beautiful and important discussion of this issue. I was just wondering, so obviously the cannibalization issue, which you talk so much about, is very much linked to the level of penetration of renewable energy in any one system. And so I wonder, are we too quick to write off market redesign and pricing mechanisms as a potential solution when currently the highest levels of penetration that we see are in like Denmark, UK, Ireland, South Australia, where that has sort of been driven by market redesign rather than like state-led investment?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'll go in reverse order. I mean, I think that I actually think that the degree of market redesign has actually been quite limited in those. I mean, the UK, for example, I think has actually pushed back against significant market redesign. I mean, I think there are lots. So there are lots, as I'm sure as the question suggests, you know this. There are lots of suggestions out there, quite creative and innovative suggestions about how you can redesign electricity markets. So, for example, one of the really interesting things that some countries have done, I mean, it's only been partially successful, is that you can introduce regional pricing, right? So that the price of electricity, particularly in wholesale markets, but also in retail markets, can actually vary geographically within countries. So Sweden has that as one example. The UK doesn't have that, but it's been talking about potentially doing it. I mean, and then there are suggestions about within wholesale markets pricing renewably generated power and fossil generated power separately, rather than the way it works at the moment, which is that you have a uniform market clearing price. And as I said earlier, I mean, I think all of those suggestions have potential advantages associated with them. However, I think that all of them also have significant pullbacks associated. And as far as I've seen, no one has yet come up with like the perfect market design, and by which I mean a market design that is kind of optimized for both accelerating decarbonisation, while both in terms of both making it attractive to the private, consistently attractive to the private sector, while also with an eye to keeping household bills down or at least level, which suggests to me that potentially the perfect market design doesn't exist. I mean, for what it's worth, my feeling is that a big part of the problem is that we historically gravitated during the 80s and 90s away from a industry/market structure, which in my view was actually much better optimized for managing and coordinating an energy transition than the one we ended up with, right? We used to have, in most parts of the world, we used to have vertically integrated electricity sectors that were typically, although not always publicly owned, either at the national level or at the territorial level, that integrated generation, transmission, distribution all under one roof. And you could kind of do things in a joined up way, which is not to say it was always done perfectly, because it wasn't. But it did allow for a degree of kind of planning and coordination that we've kind of robbed ourselves of by disaggregating it and splitting it up into generation, transmission, distribution, retail. So I think, that's the kind of the tragedy is that we've gravitated away from a system that I think would have been much better positioned to deliver what we need today. The second question was the one about there was a question about distributed energy, and
It was about the future of AI and
yes. So it's a really good question. So the point there is that AI has kind of heightened the discourse around this, but it's actually been going on for a good 10 years now, that the likes in particular of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, the big three, have been playing an increasingly important role in actually helping new renewables projects get off the ground. And the way they do that is they perform essentially the same role that governments otherwise play, which is that so if you are a wind or solar farm developer, one of the problems you will typically face in getting your project off the ground is raising the financing to get it off the ground. Because you'll go to a bank and say, can I borrow $100 million to develop this new wind farm? And the bank will say, I'd like to give you the money, but look, electricity pricing is incredibly volatile. And it's impossible to predict what electricity prices are going to be 3 months, let alone 3 years ahead. So I can't give you that money because I have no idea whether electricity prices on average over the next decade are going to be $10 per megawatt hour or $100 per megawatt hour. And you can't tell me, so I can't lend you money. And the way that governments have historically done is they've said to developers, okay, we either directly or indirectly will promise you a fixed price for your electricity for 10 to 12 years. Classic mechanism is the feed-in tariff that many people will have heard of. And when the government makes that contract offer to the developer goes back to the bank and say, look, here's the promise that I'm going to earn a certain fixed price for my electricity for the next 12 years. Now you can lend me the money. The bank said, fine, trust the government. What's happened over the last 10 years, particularly in America, but increasingly around the rest of the world, is that the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles have started doing essentially the same thing, where they basically say, we're going to build this new data center, needs lots of energy. We will buy all your electricity for the next 10 to 12 years. And because an Amazon is just as creditworthy as the American government, effectively, that serves the same functional purpose for the lenders as a feed-in tariff from the government. So there's this kind of dreadful irony that renewables development has become increasingly dependent upon companies that we kind of typically like to rag on, the Amazons and the Googles and the Microsoft, because it's their promises of buying the electricity which enable projects to get off the ground. And they obviously make huge play of that in terms of their publicity. Look how we've built or enabled the building of X hundred wind farms. So it's a real thing, but I would argue that it's not really incremental. They're allowing governments to step back from providing the promises that governments would otherwise have provided. If you see what it's a mechanism of de-risking that governments otherwise provide, and governments are very happy that the Amazons of this world are step. But of course, the problem is that there's lots of problems, but the main one is that there are only so many Amazons and Googles and Microsoft. And the types of places where they want to develop those data centers are relatively restricted. They like cold places typically, so there's loads in Scandinavia. But other parts of the world, not so much. So the idea that they're going to kind of solve the energy transition, which is what a lot of policymakers have been hoping, is pretty far-fetched.
Actually, can I change my question?
Yeah.
Because I know there is not much time left, and I was wondering, given your history, if you could give a piece of advice to our students, because you're quite peculiar, as we established at the beginning, in terms of the different disciplines together. It's a very brave thing to trespass, as Albert Hirschman used to say, between different disciplines and topics, and we're living in a world where the challenges we face increasingly require to be that interdisciplinary, which I think at the Renaissance was quite common for people to do all sorts of things. And now the incentive structure is quite different.
Yeah.
And we have students that sometimes are reading some things or feel like they're an expert in that, which is crazy because, you know, when you study, if you're already an expert in something, that kind of means you stop learning about it. So what would be your advice to them? And especially the fact that in your work, you do something that is quite formidable, that is and which we need today. Instead of just pointing figures at, you know, what everyone does wrong, you're kind of trying to understand their position. And as you said, you have the sympathy on this side. And I think nowadays we see that we're going to more and more with that kind of social division. So how do you get this as a method? So let's see, what would you advise?
I think it's really hard, precisely because of the incentive mechanisms that you talked about. I mean, I can't speak so much to UK academia because I've been in UK academia for Sweden, where I am, is an incredibly disciplinist country. People stick to their discipline, and all the incentives are around, you know, developing expertise in quite a narrow area. Funding bodies reinforce that, right? If you apply for a grant to do something that's even like slightly far away from what you've done historically, then I don't know, we can't, that's too much of a risk. And so all the incentive mechanisms are in place to keep you within your own turf. Plus, of course, the academia is famously sort of not necessarily welcoming to people stepping on their turf. And actually, it's been interesting to me that a lot of people who I would have expected would be interested in the book have almost gone out of their way to show no interest in it, precisely because it's like stepping on their toes, and they don't want people doing that, right? And that's, you know, and so it is really difficult. And so the advice I always say to people is that you sort of have to. I think you have to a certain, I mean, this is maybe the wrong language, but you have to play the game, unfortunately, until you're in a position to not play the game. Ultimately, because you have to recognize those institutional constraints and respect those institutional constraints until you're in a position to kind of ignore them. And I've kind of got to the position where I can ignore them, but not everyone is in an equally privileged position to do that. And you know, when I'm advising my own PhD students, for example, the very last thing I want to do is suggest to them that those institutional constraints are real and that they don't exist, because of course they do. And it's the wrong advice to suggest to people that you don't. However, when I think you also have, like, once you have a degree of security, I think you also then have a degree of responsibility to kind of ignore those constraints and shirk them rather than, you know, reinforcing them and reproducing them in a way that actually lots of people end up doing.
So navigating inside the box.
Yeah,
you can afford to go out of it.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah, yeah, kind of. But even then, right? Even then, there is of course, there's a huge risk in jumping around in different from area to area. But it's also, to me, I've always thought that the kind of the enjoyment of doing that and the learning new things outweighs the disadvantage of having to kind of go back to your own ladder and learn your way up again. You know, why are we in this except for learning, right? So, but it's definitely the case that the power, the structures that they are don't encourage that, you know, all the incentives just to kind of become an expert on this thing and like be an expert on that thing for 40 years. It's like I'd rather stick pins in my eyes than stick on one thing for 40 years. But I think that's the reality.
Thank you for that little advice, and thank you for you don't try, you try not to travel as much, but you accepted to come back to your alma mater to have the discussion. So thanks for taking the
Thanks
time.
for having me.
And now for all of your further questions, major criticisms and disagreements, we can continue this conversation
Sure.
over drinks just outside, but please join me in thanking Christopher.